The collapse of a civilization. Admiral Krell Voss of the Centauri Defense Fleet stood amidst the ruins of what was once the pride of his people. The Spire of Radiance, a gleaming tower that had symbolized Centauri excellence. Now it lay in ruins, shattered into lifeless rubble by relentless invaders that showed no mercy. He could still hear the distant echoes of destruction, the screams of his people, and the mechanical whir of the alien monstrosities that had torn through their defenses like paper. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the silence that followed. The silence from their supposed allies, the species that had promised solidarity in the name of the Galactic Council. They had all turned their backs, choosing to observe rather than intervene. Some even had the gall to justify it, citing the need to preserve the natural balance or learn from the Centauri's mistakes. Mistakes. Krell thought bitterly. What mistake had we made other than trusting them? Krell clenched his fists as he gazed at the sky. It was a deep, haunting crimson, a reflection of the fires raging across their once pristine cities. "Let me tell you about betrayal," he muttered, his voice bitter and raw. "Let me tell you about what happens when you call for help, only to hear silence." The Centauri had always been the jewel of the Galactic Council. Masters of quantum engineering, they had pioneered faster-than-light travel, enabling the unification of countless species across the stars. Their medical advancements had saved billions of lives. Their diplomacy had averted wars that could have wiped out entire sectors of the galaxy. And yet, in their moment of greatest need, the galaxy turned its back on them. The invaders, unrelenting, biomechanical nightmares, had appeared out of nowhere. Their purpose, to annihilate. Their methods, brutal efficiency. The Centauri had been caught off guard, despite their sophisticated sensors and predictive algorithms. In the first week, they lost 3 colonies. By the second week, their fleets were decimated. By the third, the invaders were at the gates of their homeworld, Centauri Prime. The Centauri had done what any desperate species would do. They called for help. Broadcasts were sent across the galaxy, pleading for aid. Their diplomats reached out to every advanced civilization in the Council, reminding them of centuries of cooperation and shared prosperity. But the responses were chillingly uniform. Refusal. The Novari, the oldest species in the galaxy, claimed they couldn't risk exposing their fragile ecosystems to potential contamination. The Shavrin, with their mighty war fleets, argued that their own borders were under threat, though no such threat had been reported. The Zinc Collective simply stated, "The Centauri situation is a valuable study in resilience." Study. Krell had wanted to scream at them, "My people are dying, and you want to study us." Desperation gave way to anger. Anger to despair. Krell watched as his people lost hope. Entire cities fell into chaos, with citizens fleeing to the countryside, only to be hunted down by the relentless invaders. Their once mighty fleet was reduced to scraps, their quantum shields torn apart, as if they were mere holograms. It was during one of these desperate moments, as Krell stood in the command center of their crumbling capital, that a junior officer hesitantly approached him. "Admiral," she began, her voice trembling, "we've received a response to our distress signal." Krell's heart skipped a beat. "Who?" he demanded, his voice sharper than he intended. "Which species?" answered. The officer hesitated, as if uncertain how to phrase it. "It's the humans, sir." For a moment, Krell thought he'd misheard. "Humans?" he repeated. Of all the species in the galaxy, humanity was the least likely candidate to come to their aid. The humans were newcomers to the galactic stage, having only recently achieved faster-than-light travel. Their technology was primitive, their understanding of galactic politics rudimentary. Many in the Council considered them reckless and unpredictable, a species driven by emotion rather than logic. And yet, here they were. Krell couldn't suppress a bitter laugh. "The humans," he said, shaking his head. "The galaxy's youngest species offers aid while its oldest turn their backs. Tell me, Lieutenant, what exactly do they plan to do?" Send us thoughts and prayers." The officer swallowed nervously. "They're sending ships, sir. A fleet. It's already en route." Krell froze. "A fleet," he echoed, his disbelief palpable. "They're sending more ships." "Yes, sir. They've also requested a meeting to coordinate strategies." The room fell silent. Every officer, every technician, every soldier present turned to look at Krell, their faces a mixture of hope and skepticism. Could the humans really make a difference? Could a species so young, so inexperienced, succeed where the galaxy's greatest powers had failed? Krell didn't know the answer, but he knew one thing for certain. They had no other choice. "Send them our coordinates," he ordered, "and prepare a secure channel for communication." As the humans' fleet drew closer, Krell found himself pacing the command center, his mind racing with questions. What kind of technology did they possess? What were their motives? Was this a genuine act of compassion, or did they see some advantage in aiding the Centauri? When the first human ships appeared on the horizon, Krell's questions only multiplied. The fleet was unlike anything he'd ever seen, smaller, scrappier, and clearly less advanced than Centauri vessels. But there was something about the way they moved, the precision of their formations, that hinted at a level of coordination and determination that the Centauri hadn't expected. The human flagship, a modest vessel by Centauri standards, sent a message requesting permission to dock. Krell granted it reluctantly, still unsure what to make of these newcomers. When the human delegation arrived, led by a man named Captain Elias Ward, Krell was struck by their demeanor. They were confident but not arrogant, serious but not cold. There was a fire in their eyes, a fire he hadn't seen in his own people for weeks. "We heard your call," Ward said simply, extending a hand. "We're here to help." Krell stared at the outstretched hand for a moment before taking it. It was a gesture he hadn't seen in years, physical contact, a sign of trust and solidarity. The humans might be primitive in some ways, but there was something undeniably compelling about them. As the meeting began, Ward and his team laid out their plan. It was bold, almost reckless, relying on a combination of guerrilla tactics and unorthodox strategies that no Centauri commander would have considered. Krell was skeptical, but he couldn't deny the humans' passion and determination. "You're taking a big risk," Krell said as the meeting drew to a close. Ward smiled. "So are you, Admiral. But sometimes risks are all we've got." As the humans prepared to join the fight, Krell couldn't shake the feeling that something monumental was about to happen. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself a flicker of hope. And as the first human ships launched into battle, he realized that hope wasn't misplaced. Humanity's unexpected arrival. The Centauri skies, once a brilliant cascade of shifting blues and silvers, were now a war-torn expanse of crimson streaked with ash. Admiral Krell Voss stood on the observation deck of the last operational Centauri command station, his sharp gaze fixed on the distant approach of the human fleet. It was an odd sight, ships that seemed almost cobbled together compared to the sleek and refined designs of the Centauri vessels. Yet, despite their rugged appearance, the human fleet moved with an eerie confidence, as if they belonged to this battlefield. "Admiral," the voice of Lieutenant Rena cut through his thoughts, "the human fleet is signaling their approach. They've confirmed their readiness for immediate deployment." Krell nodded but didn't take his eyes off the fleet. "What do we know about their forces?" Rena hesitated, consulting her datapad. "Their fleet consists of approximately 20 warships, most of which are unconventional in design. Weapon systems appear to be modified versions of projectile-based technologies. Their shielding systems are rudimentary compared to ours, and their propulsion systems, well, let's just say they're not winning any awards for efficiency." Krell raised an eyebrow. "And yet here they are," he said, his voice tinged with a mix of skepticism and reluctant admiration. 20 ships against an enemy that decimated 3 Centauri fleets in a matter of weeks. Either they're incredibly brave or incredibly foolish. The communication console chimed, and a holographic display lit up before Krell. Captain Elias Ward's image flickered into view, standing tall in a military uniform that was both utilitarian and battle-worn. His expression was calm but determined, his piercing eyes betraying a depth of focus that Krell had rarely seen, even among his own people. "Admiral Voss," Ward began, his voice steady and commanding. "I'd like to skip the formalities, if that's all right with you. We don't have time for pleasantries when the enemy is at your doorstep." Krell appreciated the directness, though it caught him slightly off guard. "Agreed, Captain. What's your plan?" Ward leaned forward, the faint hum of his ship's systems audible in the background. "Our strategy is simple. Hit them where they least expect it. Your forces have been fighting a defensive war, trying to hold ground. That's not going to work against an enemy like this. We need to go on the offensive, disrupt their supply lines, and force them to react to us." Krell frowned. "Offensive maneuvers against an enemy with superior firepower. That's suicide." Ward smirked faintly. "Not if you fight smart. Look, I've reviewed the data your people shared with us. These invaders, whoever or whatever they are, rely on overwhelming force and precision strikes. They're efficient, but they're not adaptable. They don't expect unpredictability, and that's exactly what humans excel at." The confidence in Ward's voice was almost infectious. Krell found himself leaning in, intrigued despite his reservations. "And how do you propose we be unpredictable?" Ward gestured to someone off-screen, and a tactical display materialized on Krell's console. It showed a map of the battlefield, with human and Centauri forces highlighted in blue and the invaders in red. "Here," Ward said, pointing to a cluster of red markers. "This is their staging ground. If we can hit it hard and fast, we can disrupt their operations and buy your people some breathing room." Krell studied the display. "And what happens when they retaliate? They'll know exactly where we came from." "That's where the second part of the plan comes in," Ward replied, his tone turning serious. "While their forces are focused on the staging ground, a secondary strike team, led by my people, will infiltrate their command ship. We believe their central AI is coordinating their entire operation. If we can take it out, we can cripple their entire fleet." The room fell silent as Krell processed the plan. It was bold, reckless even, but there was a certain logic to it. The Centauri had been fighting by the book, relying on their advanced technology and carefully calculated strategies. And yet those strategies had failed time and time again. Perhaps it was time to try something different. "You're asking us to trust you," Krell said finally, "to put the survival of my people in the hands of a species the galaxy considers unrefined." Ward's smirk returned, though it carried a hint of something deeper: resolve. "I'm not asking you to trust us, Admiral. I'm asking you to fight alongside us. Because the way I see it, we're all out of options." Krell met Ward's gaze, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. Finally, he extended a hand toward the hologram. "Very well, Captain. Let's see what humanity can do." As the human fleet began its coordinated assault, Krell watched in awe from the observation deck. The humans fought with a ferocity and ingenuity that defied logic. Their ships moved erratically, zigzagging through enemy fire in patterns that seemed chaotic, but were actually meticulously calculated. They deployed tactics that no Centauri commander would ever consider, using debris fields as cover, deploying decoy drones to confuse the enemy's targeting systems, and even weaponizing their own disabled ships as explosive projectiles. The invaders, for the first time since their arrival, seemed caught off guard. Their formations wavered, their precision faltered. And then, in a moment that Krell would later describe as nothing short of miraculous, the humans breached the staging ground. The secondary strike team, led by Ward himself, launched from the human flagship in a fleet of small, heavily armed shuttles. Their target was the enemy command ship, a massive insectoid vessel bristling with weapons and armor. The shuttles weaved through the chaos, dodging enemy fire with breathtaking precision. Krell watched, his heart pounding as the strike team disappeared into the maw of the command ship. Minutes felt like hours as the battle raged on. The human fleet took heavy losses, but they didn't waver. Krell could see the determination in their movements, the refusal to back down even in the face of overwhelming odds. It was a level of resolve that he hadn't seen in his own people since the war began. And then, just as the invaders began to regroup, it happened. The enemy command ship shuddered violently, its massive form illuminated by a series of internal explosions. Krell stared in disbelief as the ship began to break apart, its once imposing presence reduced to a crumbling husk. The invaders' forces faltered, their coordinated attacks devolving into disorganized chaos. The humans had done it. They had struck a blow that the invaders couldn't recover from. As cheers erupted across the Centauri command station, Krell felt a surge of something he hadn't experienced in weeks. Hope. Humanity, the galaxy's youngest and most underestimated species, had proven themselves in a way that no one could have anticipated. Ward's voice crackled over the comms, his tone triumphant but measured. Phase 1 complete. Admiral, the battlefield is yours. Krell couldn't suppress a smile. You've done the impossible, Captain. My people owe you a debt we can never repay. Ward's response was simple, yet profound. You'll repay it by surviving, Admiral. That's all we ask. As the human fleet regrouped and prepared for the next phase of the war, Krell found himself wondering what other surprises humanity had in store. One thing was certain, this was only the beginning of their story. And for the first time in a long time, the future didn't seem quite so bleak. The First Alliance, the Centauri War Council, convened within the crumbling halls of the Nova Citadel, a once glorious bastion of diplomacy and power that now bore the scars of the invasion. Cracked walls and flickering holo-displays served as grim reminders of how far the mighty had fallen. Admiral Krell Voss stood at the head of the table, his imposing figure framed by the dim light of a cracked skylight. Across from him, Captain Elias Ward and his human officers sat with a calm determination that felt entirely out of place in such a shattered setting. Krell scanned the room, his sharp gaze lingering on each of the Centauri delegates. Most of them looked skeptical, their eyes darting between Ward and the tactical displays projected before them. The humans were outsiders, unproven, unpredictable, and, according to many in the room, utterly unfit to be allies. And yet, they had succeeded where the galaxy's most advanced civilizations had failed. Krell clenched his jaw. The Centauri could not afford the luxury of arrogance, not now. This council is called to discuss our next steps. Krell began, his voice carrying the weight of authority. Captain Ward and his fleet have given us a fighting chance, but the enemy remains a formidable force. To stand a chance of survival, we must decide whether to formalize an alliance with humanity. A ripple of murmurs spread through the room. Counselor Alaris, an elderly Centauri with a deep-seated disdain for anything non-Centauri, was the first to speak. Admiral, while we cannot ignore the humans' contribution, we must question their motives. Why would a species with no ties to our people risk their lives for us? What do they stand to gain? Ward, seated calmly at the table, met Alaris's gaze without flinching. We gain nothing, Counselor, he said, his tone steady but firm. Humanity has no interest in your resources, your technology, or your territory. We're here because we believe in something your so-called allies seem to have forgotten: the value of life. If we stood by and did nothing while your people were slaughtered, we'd be no better than the invaders. The room fell silent. Ward's words hung heavy in the air, a stark contrast to the cold pragmatism that had defined the Galactic Council's response to the Centauri crisis. Krell allowed the silence to linger for a moment before speaking. Captain Ward is correct, he said, his voice cutting through the tension. Our so-called allies have abandoned us. Humanity is the only species willing to stand with us, despite having no obligation to do so. That Counselor Alaris speaks volumes about their character. Alaris' expression hardened, but he said nothing. Krell turned his attention back to Ward. Captain, you've proven your courage on the battlefield. Now, I ask you to prove your commitment to this alliance. What do you propose as our next move? Ward nodded, his demeanor shifting into one of focused determination. The enemy is on the back foot after our last engagement, but they're regrouping quickly. If we're going to turn the tide, we need to hit them hard and fast. My proposal is simple. We pool our resources and mount a joint operation to reclaim your outer colonies. Those colonies are rich in resources and strategic value. If we can secure them, we'll have a base of operations to launch further offensives. Krell leaned forward, his fingers steepled as he considered the plan. And how do you propose we take back the colonies? The enemy's forces there are entrenched, and our fleets are severely depleted. Ward's lips curved into a faint smile. That's where human ingenuity comes in. We've been analyzing the enemy's patterns, and we've identified a critical vulnerability in their supply chain. Their forces rely on automated resupply convoys that follow predetermined routes. If we can disrupt those convoys, we can weaken their hold on the colonies and force them to spread their forces thin. A young Centauri officer, Lieutenant Rena, spoke up. Disrupting their supply chain would buy us time, but it won't be enough to secure the colonies. We'll need to coordinate ground assaults as well. Ward nodded. Exactly. My team has experience in guerrilla warfare, something the Centauri haven't had to consider in centuries. We'll deploy small, mobile strike teams to infiltrate the colonies and sabotage key enemy infrastructure. Meanwhile, your forces can focus on providing air and orbital support. The room erupted into a flurry of discussion, with counselors and officers debating the merits of the plan. Krell listened carefully, weighing the arguments. The plan was bold, unconventional, and risky. But then, so was trusting humanity. Finally, Krell raised a hand, and the room fell silent. Captain Ward, he said, his tone measured, you've given us a path forward. It's not without risks, but it's better than waiting for the enemy to finish us off. You have my support. One by one, the counselors nodded their agreement, some reluctantly, others with quiet resolve. The alliance was formalized in that moment, a partnership born not of convenience, but of necessity. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Human engineers worked side by side with Centauri technicians to retrofit damaged ships, blending Centauri precision with human ingenuity. Human soldiers trained Centauri resistance fighters in guerrilla tactics, teaching them to adapt and improvise in ways that felt alien to their regimented military culture. Krell found himself spending more and more time with Ward, strategizing and coordinating the joint effort. Despite their differences, the two leaders developed a mutual respect. Krell admired Ward's resourcefulness and unshakable resolve, while Ward was impressed by Krell's tactical brilliance and unwavering commitment to his people. As the day of the operation approached, the Alliance forces gathered in orbit around Centauri Prime. The combined fleet was a patchwork of human and Centauri ships, each one a testament to the resilience of its crew. Krell stood on the bridge of the Centauri flagship, watching as the fleet prepared to jump to hyperspace. Admiral, Ward's voice came over the comms. I've just received confirmation from our forward scouts. The enemy has begun resupply operations at Colony Theta 9. This is our window. Krell nodded. Understood, Captain. We'll proceed as planned. May the stars guide us. The fleet jumped as one, emerging moments later in the chaotic expanse of the Theta 9 system. The battle began immediately, with the combined forces executing their carefully coordinated assault. Human and Centauri ships fought side by side, their differences in design and tactics creating a synergy that the enemy hadn't anticipated. On the ground, Ward led the first strike team into the heart of the enemy's operations. Armed with a combination of human tenacity and Centauri technology, the team dismantled enemy supply depots and disrupted communications, throwing the invaders into disarray. For Krell, watching the operation unfold was nothing short of awe-inspiring. The humans fought with a level of adaptability and determination that defied logic. Where Centauri forces relied on precision and planning, the humans thrived in chaos, turning even the most desperate situations to their advantage. By the end of the day, the colony was theirs. The enemy, caught off guard and unable to regroup, had been forced to retreat. Cheers erupted across the fleet as the news spread. A victory not just for the Centauri, but for the Alliance as a whole. Krell stood on the bridge of his flagship, his heart swelling with a sense of hope he hadn't felt in weeks. Humanity had proven themselves not just as allies, but as partners. Together, they had achieved what neither species could have done alone. And as the fleet prepared for the next phase of their campaign, Krell couldn't help but wonder what other victories lay ahead for this unlikely alliance. For the first time, he dared to believe that the Centauri might have a future after all. The turning point. The Centauri system had not seen such a concentrated effort of hope and rebellion in generations. The victory at Colony Theta 9 was monumental, but it was only the beginning of a much larger campaign. The alliance between humans and Centauri had shifted from a temporary collaboration to a genuine partnership, and now, as both species prepared for the next stage of the war, the question lingered: could this fragile alliance stand against the overwhelming might of the invaders? Admiral Krell Voss stood on the observation deck of the Aegis Ascendant, his flagship, reviewing the latest tactical data. The enemy's forces were regrouping, their massive fleets consolidating into a single formidable armada. The invaders had learned from their previous defeats and were now preparing to strike back with unrelenting force. Krell's brows furrowed as he studied the enemy's formations. They were shifting their focus to the Centauri capital system, where the bulk of the Alliance's resources were now concentrated. "Admiral," a voice called out behind him. Krell turned to see Captain Elias Ward, his human counterpart, stepping onto the deck. The man looked tired, but his sharp gaze carried the same fire that had inspired Krell during their first meeting. "Captain," Krell greeted him, motioning for Ward to join him. "It seems our enemies have decided to consolidate their forces. If their calculations are correct, they'll be launching an assault on Centauri Prime within the next 72 hours. Ward nodded, his lips pressing into a thin line as he studied the display. "That's what I expected. They're trying to wipe us out in one decisive blow." Krell crossed his arms, his expression grim. "And they might succeed. Their numbers are overwhelming. Even with our combined fleets, we can't match them in sheer firepower." Ward smirked faintly, his gaze flickering toward Krell. "We don't need to match them, Admiral. We just need to outthink them." The Centauri leader raised an eyebrow. "Do you have something in mind, Captain? Because at this point, I'm willing to entertain any plan that doesn't end with my people's extinction." Ward's smirk grew into a full grin. "As a matter of fact, I do. It's risky, but if it works, we can turn the tables on them once and for all." A bold strategy. Ward's plan was unorthodox, to say the least. The humans had identified a critical vulnerability in the enemy's approach: their reliance on centralized coordination. The invaders' fleets were controlled by a network of command ships, each one linked to a central hub that issued orders and synchronized their movements. If the hub could be taken offline, the enemy's forces would be thrown into chaos. The problem, of course, was reaching the hub. It was heavily fortified, surrounded by a fleet that dwarfed anything the Alliance could muster. A direct assault would be suicide. "That's why we're not going to attack it directly," Ward explained during the strategy meeting. His holographic projection illuminated the gathered officers, both human and Centauri. "Instead, we're going to lure them into a trap." He gestured to a point on the map, a barren system on the outskirts of Centauri space. "This is the Orion Rift. It's a graveyard of shattered planets and asteroid fields, with gravitational anomalies that interfere with most sensors. If we can lure their fleet into the rift, we can use the environment to level the playing field." Counselor Alaris, ever the skeptic, scoffed. "And how do you propose we lure them there?" "The invaders aren't mindless. They won't chase us blindly into a trap." Ward's grin returned, his confidence unwavering. "We'll make them think they're chasing an easy target. We'll send a decoy fleet, just enough to draw their attention. and bait them into pursuing us. Once they're in the rift, we'll hit them with everything we've got." The room fell silent as the officers processed the plan. It was audacious, bordering on reckless, but it had a certain logic to it. The Centauri had been fighting defensively for so long that the idea of taking the fight to the enemy was both terrifying and exhilarating. Krell was the first to speak. "It's a bold plan, Captain, but it relies heavily on deception and timing. If even one element fails, the consequences could be catastrophic." Ward nodded. "I know the risks, Admiral, but this is our best shot. If we can cripple their fleet, we'll buy ourselves the time we need to rebuild and regroup." Krell took a deep breath, his gaze sweeping across the room. "Very well. Let's do it. Into the rift." The Alliance fleet began preparations immediately. Human engineers worked tirelessly to modify Centauri ships with stealth technology and decoy emitters, creating a fleet that appeared far larger and more powerful than it actually was. Meanwhile, Centauri scientists developed specialized drones designed to exploit the rift's gravitational anomalies, creating artificial debris fields that could be weaponized against the enemy. As the decoy fleet set out, Krell found himself once again marveling at humanity's ingenuity. The humans had an uncanny ability to adapt, to take what little they had and turn it into something extraordinary. It was a quality that the Centauri, for all their technological advancements, had lost over centuries of complacency. Ward personally led the decoy fleet, piloting one of the modified Centauri cruisers. "We're the bait," he told his crew with a grin. "Let's make it look convincing." The invaders took the bait almost immediately. The decoy fleet's sudden appearance on their sensors, coupled with the illusion of overwhelming firepower, was enough to provoke a response. The enemy's armada surged toward the Orion Rift, their relentless pursuit playing directly into the Alliance's hands. Krell watched from the bridge of the Aegis Ascended as the trap was sprung. As soon as the enemy fleet entered the rift, the decoy fleet disappeared, activating their stealth systems and blending seamlessly into the environment. Confused and disoriented, the invaders began to spread out, searching for their elusive prey. That was when the real fleet struck. The turning tide. The Alliance's combined forces emerged from the shadows, launching a coordinated assault that took the enemy completely off guard. Human ships darted through the asteroid fields, using the debris as cover, while unleashing devastating salvos of torpedoes and plasma cannons. Centauri vessels provided long-range support, their advanced targeting systems picking off key enemy ships with surgical precision. The enemy's command ship, the central hub of their coordination network, became the primary target. A team of human and Centauri operatives infiltrated the massive vessel, their mission to disable its systems and sever the enemy's control. Ward led the team himself, his leadership inspiring both humans and Centauri to push beyond their limits. The infiltration was a brutal, close-quarters battle, with the operatives fighting their way through waves of biomechanical soldiers. But their determination was unyielding, and after what felt like an eternity, they'd reached the command core. Ward planted the explosive charges himself, his hand steady despite the chaos around him. "We've got 5 minutes to get out of here," he said, his voice calm but urgent. "Move." The team barely escaped as the charges detonated, obliterating the command core in a blinding explosion. The ripple effect was immediate. The enemy fleet, deprived of its central coordination, began to falter. Ships collided with each other, their movements erratic and uncoordinated. On the Aegis Ascendant, Krell watched in awe as the tide of battle turned. The Alliance's forces pressed their advantage, dismantling the enemy fleet piece by piece. What had seemed like an insurmountable challenge only hours ago now felt like a victory within reach, a hard-won victory. By the end of the day, the enemy's armada was in ruins. The Orion Rift, once a graveyard of forgotten worlds, had become the site of the Alliance's greatest triumph. Cheers erupted across the fleet as the news spread, a sound that carried with it a renewed sense of hope. Krell stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the stars beyond the rift. Humanity had done the impossible, proving not only their worth as allies, but their resilience as a species. The Centauri had learned much from their human counterparts, about courage, about adaptability, and about the power of unity. As Captain Ward's ship returned to the fleet, Krell found himself smiling for the first time in weeks. The war was far from over, but for the first time, he believed they had a chance. "Captain," Krell said as Ward stepped onto the bridge, his uniform scorched and battle-worn. "You've earned the respect of my people. And of me." Ward grinned, his eyes gleaming with determination. "This is just the beginning, Admiral. We're not done yet." Krell nodded, his heart swelling with pride and hope. Together, humans and Centauri had turned the tide. And together, they would fight for the future of the galaxy. The cost of bravery. The Orion Rift victory was a triumph unlike any the Centauri had ever witnessed. For the first time in living memory, a seemingly invincible enemy had been defeated, not by overwhelming technological superiority, but by grit, ingenuity, and an alliance forged in desperation. Yet, as the combined fleets of humans and Centauri limped back to Centaura Prime, the cost of their bravery became all too apparent. Admiral Krell Voss stood in the war room of the Aegis Ascendant, surrounded by holographic projections of the battle's aftermath. The room was quieter than usual, the mood somber. Ships that had once been proud symbols of defiance were now little more than shattered hulks, drifting aimlessly in the void. Lives had been lost, thousands of them, human and Centauri alike. The price of victory weighed heavily on everyone. "Admiral," a voice broke through the silence. Krell turned to see Lieutenant Rena, her usually confident demeanor subdued. "The casualty reports have been finalized." Krell took the datapad from her hands and scanned the contents. The numbers were staggering. Nearly half of the Alliance fleet had been destroyed. Human forces, despite their smaller numbers, had suffered disproportionately high losses, their daring tactics often putting them in the most dangerous positions. Among the fallen were some of humanity's finest officers, men and women who had given their lives for a cause that wasn't even their own. "How is Captain Ward?" Krell asked, his voice quieter than usual. "He's stable," Rena replied. "He was injured during the infiltration of the enemy command ship, but the medics say he'll recover." "Barely." Krell nodded, relief mingling with guilt. Ward's plan had saved them all, but it had also nearly cost him his life. The human captain had risked everything for a species that had once looked down on his own. Krell couldn't help but wonder if he would have done the same in Ward's position. The weight of sacrifice. Later that day, Krell visited the medical bay, a sprawling facility filled with rows of injured soldiers. The air was thick with the hum of medical equipment and the quiet murmurs of medics tending to their patients. Krell moved through the aisles, his sharp eyes taking in the faces of those who had fought so bravely. Human and Centauri lay side by side, their injuries a testament to the ferocity of the battle. At the far end of the room, Krell found Ward. The human captain was propped up on a cot, his arm in a sling and a bandage wrapped around his head. Despite his injuries, Ward's eyes were sharp as ever, a flicker of determination still burning within them. "Admiral," Ward greeted him with a faint smile. "Come to check if I'm still breathing." Krell allowed himself a rare smile. "Something like that. How are you feeling, Captain?" "Like I got run over by a star cruiser," Ward replied, his tone laced with dry humor. "But I'll live." Krell pulled up a chair and sat beside him. For a moment, the two men sat in silence, the weight of the war hanging heavy between them. Finally, Krell spoke. "You've done more for my people than anyone could have expected," he said quietly. "But the cost, it's higher than I imagined." Ward nodded, his expression turning serious. "That's war, Admiral. It's never clean, and it's never fair. All we can do is make sure the sacrifices mean something." Krell's gaze dropped to the floor, his thoughts heavy. "Do you ever wonder if it's worth it? If all this death and destruction is truly justified?" Ward's eyes hardened, his voice steady. Every day. But if we don't fight, if we don't stand up to those who would destroy us, then what are we fighting for? The people we've lost. They gave their lives for something greater than themselves. We owe it to them to keep going. Krell looked at the human captain, his respect for the man growing with each passing moment. Ward's words carried a truth that Krell couldn't deny. The cost of bravery was high, but the cost of inaction was far greater. A fractured alliance. As the days turned into weeks, the alliance began the arduous process of rebuilding. Damaged ships were repaired, new strategies were devised, and the dead were honored with solemn ceremonies. Yet beneath the surface, cracks began to form in the alliance. The Centauri Council, ever pragmatic, began to question the sustainability of their partnership with humanity. Councillor Elaris, the loudest voice of dissent, argued that the humans' reckless tactics were causing unnecessary losses. We cannot afford to throw lives away, Elaris declared during a council meeting. The humans fight with passion, yes, but passion alone will not win this war. We must rely on logic and strategy, not blind bravery. Krell slammed his hand on the table, his patience wearing thin. And where has your logic gotten us, Elaris? If not for the humans, we wouldn't even be having this discussion. We'd be dead. The room fell silent, the tension palpable. Elaris glared at Krell, but said nothing further. Krell knew the counselor's words carried some truth. Humanity's tactics were indeed risky, and their losses were significant. But he also knew that without humanity's ingenuity and resolve, the Centauri would have been lost long ago. Ward, who had been present at the meeting, remained quiet until the council adjourned. As the delegates filed out, he approached Krell, his expression thoughtful. "They're scared," Ward said simply, "and scared people do stupid things." Krell sighed, rubbing his temples. "I can't blame them. My people aren't used to this kind of war. They've spent centuries relying on technology and diplomacy to solve their problems. Now they're being forced to fight for their survival in ways they never imagined." Ward placed a hand on Krell's shoulder, his grip firm. "They'll adapt. They have to. The alternative isn't an option." The human spirit. Despite the tensions, humanity's resolve never wavered. They continued to push forward, their determination inspiring the Centauri to do the same. Krell began to notice subtle changes in his people, an unspoken shift in their attitudes. The Centauri, once rigid and methodical, were learning to embrace the unpredictability and creativity that defined humanity. Lieutenant Rena, one of Krell's most trusted officers, was a prime example. She had taken to working closely with human engineers, adopting their improvisational approach to problem-solving. Under her leadership, a damaged Centauri warship had been transformed into a hybrid vessel, combining the best of Centauri technology with human ingenuity. Krell watched with quiet pride as his people began to adapt and evolve. The alliance was no longer a partnership of necessity. It was becoming something deeper, something stronger, a new resolve. As preparations for the next phase of the war continued, Krell found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. The cost of bravery had been immense, but it had also revealed something extraordinary: the unyielding spirit of humanity and the resilience of the Centauri. Standing on the observation deck of the Aegis Ascendant, Krell gazed out at the stars. The road ahead was long and fraught with danger, but for the first time, he felt a renewed sense of hope. Together, humans and Centauri had faced the impossible and emerged stronger. And together, they would finish what they had started. The final battle. The Alliance fleet hovered in the void above Centauri Prime, a mismatched but resolute collection of human and Centauri vessels ready to face the ultimate challenge. After weeks of rebuilding, strategizing, and relentless training, the day had finally come. The invaders, having recovered from their defeat in the Orion Rift, were amassing their full might for one last, devastating assault. This would be the battle that determined not only the fate of the Centauri, but also the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. Admiral Krell Voss stood on the bridge of the Aegis Ascendant, his sharp eyes locked on the tactical display before him. Thousands of red markers representing the enemy fleet slowly crept closer, a tidal wave of destruction that stretched across the holographic map like a dark omen. It was an overwhelming sight, even for someone as seasoned as Krell. But beside him stood Captain Elias Ward, his human counterpart, exuding a calm confidence that steadied Krell's nerves. "Quite the welcoming committee," Ward said, his voice tinged with dry humor. "They must really want to end this." "They do," Krell replied, his tone grim. "And so do we." The plan they had devised was as audacious as it was desperate. With the Centauri homeworld under siege, retreat was not an option. The Alliance would make their stand here, turning the very environment of Centaura Prime into a weapon. If they succeeded, they would cripple the invaders' ability to wage war. If they failed, there would be no one left to remember their sacrifice. The calm before the storm. The hours leading up to the battle were filled with a quiet intensity. Crews worked tirelessly to ensure their ships were combat-ready, while soldiers prepared for ground operations on the planet's surface. Human and Centaurid forces, now more unified than ever, exchanged words of encouragement and camaraderie. The lines that had once divided them, differences in culture, technology, and philosophy, had blurred in the crucible of war. In the hangar bay of the Aegis Ascendant, Lieutenant Rena oversaw the final deployment of hybrid strike teams. These units, composed of both human and Centauri soldiers, represented the culmination of the Alliance's cooperation. They had trained together, fought together, and bled together. Now they would face their greatest challenge yet. Rena approached one of the human team leaders, a grizzled veteran named Sergeant Connor Hale. "Your squad ready, Sergeant?" she asked. Hale grinned, his face marked by scars and determination. "Always, Lieutenant. You Centauri sure know how to throw a party. Let's hope the guests behave." Rena allowed herself a small smile. "Let's hope we survive to see the cleanup." The battle begins. The enemy fleet arrived with terrifying precision, their biomechanical ships dark and angular, bristling with weaponry. They emerged from hyperspace like predators stalking their prey, surrounding the planet in a menacing blockade. The Alliance fleet, dwarfed in size and firepower, held its position, waiting for the right moment to strike. Krell's voice echoed across the comms, steady and commanding. "All ships, maintain formation. Wait for my signal." Ward, standing beside him, added, "Remember, we're not just fighting for survival. We're fighting to show them that we won't be broken." The first wave came swiftly. Enemy fighters swarmed toward the Alliance fleet, their movements eerily coordinated. Human and Centauri pilots launched in response, their ships weaving through the chaos with a mixture of discipline and daring. The battle erupted into a symphony of explosions and laser fire, the void alight with the fury of war. On the planet's surface, the ground assault began. The invaders deployed their mechanical legions, towering constructs that trampled everything in their path. Hybrid strike teams engaged them with guerrilla tactics, using the dense urban terrain of Centaura Prime cities to their advantage. Human ingenuity and Centauri precision worked in tandem, turning the invaders' own tactics against them. A desperate gamble. The turning point of the battle came when the Alliance activated the planetary defense grid, a massive network of energy cannons and shielding systems designed to protect Centaura Prime. The grid had been offline for years, a relic of an earlier era, but human engineers had managed to restore it in the weeks leading up to the battle. As the first energy blasts tore through the enemy fleet, cheers erupted across the Alliance comms. The invaders, caught off guard, scrambled to regroup. Krell seized the opportunity. "Now," he barked, "launch the interceptors." A wave of human and Centauri ships broke formation, diving straight into the heart of the enemy fleet. These were the interceptors, smaller, faster ships equipped with experimental weaponry designed to disrupt the invaders' biomechanical systems. It was a risky maneuver, but it paid off. The interceptors carved a path through the enemy lines, forcing them to divert resources away from their assault on the planet. Ward led one of these squadrons himself, his ship weaving through enemy fire with breathtaking precision. "Keep the pressure on," he shouted over the comms. "We've got them on the run." The final push. Despite their successes, the Alliance forces were pushed to their limits. The invaders, relentless and adaptive, began to regain their footing. On the ground, the hybrid strike teams faced overwhelming odds as reinforcements poured in from orbit. In the skies, the Alliance fleet took heavy losses, each explosion a painful reminder of the stakes. Krell knew they couldn't sustain this pace much longer. Desperation clawed at the edges of his mind, but he refused to let it take hold. "Captain Ward," he said, his voice tight, "what's the status of the infiltration team?" Ward's voice crackled over the comms. "They're in position, preparing to breach the command vessel now." The infiltration team, composed of the Alliance's best operatives, had a singular mission: to disable the invaders' central control unit. Without it, their forces would fall into disarray. It was a dangerous mission, with no guarantee of success. Krell watched the tactical display as the infiltration team's ship approached the massive enemy command vessel. The team's progress was slow, each step a battle against the vessel's defenses, but they pressed on, their determination unyielding. Victory at a cost. When the infiltration team finally reached the command core, their victory came at a heavy price. Several operatives were lost in the final push, their sacrifices carving a path for the team's leader, a human named Lieutenant Sarah Vega, to plant the explosives. Her voice came over the comms, steady despite the chaos around her. "Charges are set," she reported. "We've got 2 minutes to get out of here." The team barely made it to their escape pods before the command vessel erupted in a blinding explosion. The shockwave rippled across the battlefield, sending enemy ships into disarray. Without their central control, the invaders' movements became erratic and disorganized. Krell seized the moment. "All units, advance. Press the attack." The Alliance forces surged forward, their combined strength overwhelming the scattered remnants of the enemy fleet. On the ground, the hybrid strike teams launched a coordinated counteroffensive, driving the invaders out of the cities and back toward their landing zones. By the time the battle ended, the enemy fleet was shattered, their ground forces in full retreat. Centauri Prime had been saved. A new beginning. As the dust settled, Krell and Ward stood together on the surface of Centauri Prime, surveying the aftermath. The city was battered but still standing, its people emerging from their shelters to celebrate the hard-won victory. Human and Centauri soldiers embraced, their bond forged in the fires of war. "We did it," Ward said, his voice filled with quiet pride. Krell nodded, a rare smile crossing his face. "We did, but we couldn't have done it without you, Captain." Ward grinned. "Let's just hope this is the beginning of something better for both our peoples." As the two leaders shook hands, the sun broke through the clouds, casting a warm light over the battlefield. It was a new dawn for the Centauri and humanity, a dawn forged in unity, resilience, and the unbreakable spirit of those who dared to fight for a brighter future. The legacy of unity. The victory over the invaders was a momentous turning point, not just for the Centauri and humanity, but for the entire galaxy. The once mighty enemy fleet had been reduced to scattered remnants, fleeing into the far reaches of space. Their command systems were in ruins, and their capacity to wage war had been obliterated. Centauri Prime, battered but unbroken, stood as a symbol of resilience and defiance, a testament to what could be achieved when two vastly different species worked together. Admiral Krell Voss and Captain Elias Ward now faced the monumental task of rebuilding, not only their fleets but the trust and hope of their people. The war had ended, but its scars were everywhere, on the cities, the ships, and the hearts of those who had survived. The days after the battle. Krell stood on the balcony of the Nova Citadel, overlooking the city of Tulsoria. Once a shining jewel of Centauri civilization, it was now a patchwork of ruins and hastily constructed shelters. Yet, amidst the rubble, there was movement. People rebuilding, working side by side with human engineers and soldiers. The sight filled him with a strange mix of pride and sorrow. Captain Ward joined him, his arm still in a sling from injuries sustained during the battle. "It's strange, isn't it?" he said, leaning against the railing. "How something as terrible as war can bring out the best in people." Krell nodded, his gaze distant. "I've seen my people transform in ways I never thought possible. And it's because of yours, Captain. Humanity has taught us resilience, adaptability, and hope." Ward chuckled softly. "Hope can be a dangerous thing. It's what kept us going when the odds were stacked against us. But it's also what makes us reckless." Krell turned to him, a faint smile on his lips. "Sometimes, reckless is exactly what's needed." The two men stood in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared experiences hanging between them. Finally, Ward broke the silence. "The question now is, what happens next?" he asked. "We've won the war, but the galaxy's still a mess. And let's not forget, the Council's been pretty quiet through all of this." Krell's expression hardened. "The Council abandoned us. They stood by and watched as my people were slaughtered. And now that we've survived, they'll want to take credit for our victory." Ward smirked. "Not if we don't let them." A message to the galaxy. The Alliance's victory had sent shockwaves through the galaxy. News of the Centauri and humanity's triumph spread quickly, carried by traders, diplomats, and refugees. For many, it was a story of inspiration, an example of what could be achieved when species set aside their differences and work together. But for the Galactic Council, it was a wake-up call. Krell and Ward knew they needed to act quickly to solidify the Alliance's position. Together, they crafted a message to be broadcast across the galaxy, a declaration of unity and defiance. Standing side by side in the Nova Citadel's Grand Hall, they addressed the galaxy. "This war has shown us the true nature of strength," Krell began, his voice steady and commanding. "Strength is not measured by technology or resources, but by the bonds we forge and the values we uphold. When the galaxy turned its back on us, humanity stood with us. Together, we achieved the impossible." Ward stepped forward, his tone resolute. "To the Galactic Council, and to all who watched from the sidelines, know this. The alliance between humanity and the Centauri is not a temporary arrangement. It is a foundation for a new future, one built on cooperation, mutual respect, and a shared determination to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The message was clear. The alliance was here to stay, and it would not be silenced or sidelined. Across the galaxy, it was met with a mixture of awe, admiration, and, in some quarters, unease. The old powers of the Council knew that the balance of power had shifted, and they would have to adapt to this new reality. The Memorial of Heroes. In the weeks following the victory, the Centauri and humanity collaborated to construct a grand memorial on Centaur Prime. The site, situated in the heart of Tulsoria, was a sprawling plaza surrounded by gardens. At its center stood two towering statues, one of a Centauri soldier, the other of a human. They stood back to back, their weapons lowered, symbolizing unity and shared sacrifice. The names of the fallen were etched into the base of the statues, a somber reminder of the cost of freedom. Families from both species gathered to pay their respects, their grief mingling with pride. Krell and Ward attended the dedication ceremony, standing among the crowd as the memorial was unveiled. Krell found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them here, the battles, the losses, and the unlikely friendship that had formed between two species once separated by vast cultural divides. Ward leaned over and whispered, "I think we did good, Admiral." Krell nodded, his voice quiet. "We did, but the work isn't finished. A new mission." The Alliance, forged in the fires of war, now turned its attention to the future. Reconstruction efforts were underway on Centaur Prime, with human and Centauri teams working tirelessly to rebuild cities, restore infrastructure, and care for the wounded. But Krell and Ward knew that the Alliance's mission couldn't end with rebuilding. The galaxy was still a dangerous place, and the remnants of the invaders were out there, lurking in the shadows. "We need to take the fight to them," Ward said during one of their strategy meetings. "Hunt down their remnants before they can regroup." Krell agreed. "But it's not just about fighting. We need to rebuild trust across the galaxy. Show other species that the Alliance is a force for good, not just war." To that end, the Alliance began reaching out to other civilizations, offering aid and support to those who had been affected by the war. They sent medical teams to devastated planets, shared their newfound tactics and technology, and worked to foster a spirit of cooperation that had long been absent from galactic politics. The legacy of the Alliance. As the months turned into years, the Alliance became a beacon of hope in a galaxy that had grown weary of division and conflict. The Centauri, once a proud but insular civilization, opened their borders to trade and cultural exchange. Humanity, still young on the galactic stage, earned a reputation as bold, resourceful, and compassionate allies. Krell and Ward continued to lead the Alliance, their partnership a symbol of what could be achieved through unity. Together, they navigated the challenges of rebuilding and diplomacy, always mindful of the sacrifices that had brought them this far. One evening, as they stood once again on the balcony of the Nova Citadel, Ward turned to Krell with a thoughtful expression. "Do you think they'll remember this?" he asked. "What we've done here?" Krell smiled faintly. "They will. Not because of statues or speeches, but because we've shown them what's possible. We've given them something to believe in." Ward nodded, his gaze drifting to the stars. "Here's to the future, Admiral, whatever it brings." Krell followed his gaze, the faint glimmer of hope in his chest growing stronger. "To the future, Captain. Together." And with that, the two leaders stood in silence, their eyes fixed on the horizon, as the first ships of the Alliance's new exploratory fleet launched into the unknown. The war was over, but the story of humanity and the Centauri had only just begun.